Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Go Big or Go Home. I am Old Man Troy, joined by the wonderful youngster, Kevin Cunningham, a.k.a. Kid Cunny on Twitter. What's shaking today, my friend?
Nothing shaking. Just writing about some high school sports in Wisconsin. As you know, Troy, humongous, talented, and very important high school sports going on at this point in time in the state of Wisconsin, which I know most of our listeners don't care about high school sports in Wisconsin outside of the Wisconsin Badgers fans, which you still might not even care. So that's all I've been doing today. But tell me about your day.
Nothing to tell. Just another work day.
Yep.
Another work day. I was telling you, though, as we record this show via technology, I'm not liking this new technology. I had to get a new phone. For those listeners out there, I had a pretty rough end of May. So did the youngster. We're in June. But, man, Kevin, this phone, doesn't carry service anywhere. I know that I told you I'm going into a dead zone. In the next 10 to 30 minutes, boom, we want to try to record the show. Boom, dead zone. So hopefully I don't have too many more drop out of the podcast today. I really don't want to. And I can't tell when I'm talking either. I don't even hear a beep. It just ends on me. So we're going to get right to it, though. Supposedly an abbreviated show, youngster, but I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. We'll still go an hour. What's happening over there in the world of NCAA baseball?
Well, we talked about softball on last week's show, and what was it? It was, I think there were five Big Ten softball teams that made the NCAA tournament, and in order to get out of your regional, you are in a little pod of four. So there are 16 pods of 4 schools, and the top-ranked team in those pods get to host, and there were no Big Ten teams hosting in the softball NCAA tournament, and all 5 of them got bounced in the first round. So that was unfortunate. But to move to baseball, a little baseball update. We mentioned a week ago that, we're hopeful that one of these baseball teams make it so that we have some team to talk about with baseball and softball. And Minnesota was probably the most likely team to be able to advance, as they were the top-ranked team in their little regional. So they hosted the regional over the last couple days, over the weekend, and I wrote some stuff about it over Atlanta 10, and they were able to advance. So that's good. The other teams, the other 3 teams, there was Purdue, there's Ohio State. I'm looking at the bracket now. Purdue, Ohio State, Indiana, and I think that might have been it. Purdue, Ohio State, Indiana. Those 3 schools got eliminated in the first round, but Minnesota, at least, for our sake, Troy, was able to advance. So we can talk more in depth about Minnesota baseball, but again, like last week, I just don't follow Big Ten baseball like that. If you're looking for a Big Ten baseball podcast, I guess, we're looking to provide listeners with just the biggest things that are going on in the Big Ten Conference now, and unfortunately, for myself anyway, I don't follow Big Ten baseball like that. I know Minnesota had a great regular season. I know they won the Big Ten tournament, and that's why they got a number 1 seed in this regional that was hosted in Minneapolis, and they advanced, and that's cool. And they play the winner of the Corvallis regional, which is held by Oregon State. Oregon State made their way out of their own regional. The wording got mixed up there. Oregon State was the top-ranked team in their regional. They were able to advance as well, so that's Minnesota's next opponent. Minnesota is the only team, again, in the Big Ten representing the conference for the NCAA tournament. They play Oregon State, I believe. Let's see, I'll be able to find out the dates in a second here, but that's the team that they're playing in the next round. It's basically a best of 3. So if you advance, if Minnesota advances past Oregon State, they would move on to the College World Series. So not necessarily at this point at the time of our recording, because regional play is not concluded just yet. I believe it concludes today as we're recording on a Monday, June 4th. Most of the teams have gotten out of their regionals already. There's, 3 teams, 3 regionals that are left to be played out. But 13 of the 16 teams are known that have moved on to super regionals. And then again, of those 16, the next 8 will advance over the next week, and we will know who makes the College World Series. And I heard Troy, I believe, ding out of our call here, so I will keep talking until he returns, and I'll ask him about baseball. But Minnesota is the only team, and I just heard the beep. Minnesota is the only Big Ten team moving on. And again, we know 13 of the 16 teams moving on, and if Minnesota can beat Oregon State, they'll move on to the College World Series. What does that mean to you, Troy? Does that mean, I guess I would have to look up Big Ten history in terms of when's the last team that made a College World Series? I think it's been a while, because I think I remember on last year's show that we did this, there was no team that made it. And we looked, and it's like, wow, it's been a struggling time for the Big Ten when it comes to baseball. But so Minnesota moving on at least to super regionals. I guess what's your take on that, Troy?
I'm excited about it. I like it. It's awesome that their Big Ten is represented at least in a super regional. And Minnesota, like you said, we're not going to sit here and break down player by player, pitching staff, where their strengths, where their weaknesses are. Like you, I never watched a Minnesota game all year. Will I now? Yeah. And that's what the exciting part is. We do a Big Ten podcast, so we cheer for all the Big Ten teams. Even though I'm a Badger fan, I want to see the Big Ten do well. Now, if it was Minnesota against Wisconsin, you know where my loyalty is going to be. But with Minnesota moving on, that is good for the conference. You know, they had good representation in the tournament, but again, only one number 1 seed in Minnesota, and they advanced. So there was no upset there. At least they got out. Now they have a chance. You know, they could possibly move on to the College World Series, which in my mind would be great representation for the Big Ten at that point. So I'm excited for Minnesota, Kevin. Even though I'm a Badger fan, still cheer for the Big Ten.
Yeah, no, I agree. I can honestly say there's no allegiance for me when it comes to Big Ten baseball. I like Ohio State football. Basketball-wise, I just kind of float around and pick my team year by year. It's like, hey, this team should be cool to watch. So they'll be my, I guess, quote-unquote, favorite Big Ten basketball team to watch this year. I did that with, I think it was Purdue a couple of years ago. Michigan State was obviously going to be very talented this past year, and yet Michigan is the one that made the title game and surprised basically everyone. So that was cool. Minnesota baseball moving on to super regionals is also cool. I'll say this, that if they do make the College World Series, I'll know more. And Troy and I can discuss on next week's show more about the College World Series, more about the other teams that are in that make the College World Series. We'll dive a little deeper, as that would be a legitimate accomplishment for any Big Ten team, Minnesota included. You know, they were the best baseball team in the conference this year. They proved that in the conference tournament, and they're proving it in the NCAA tournament as well. So next week's show, we'll definitely give an update. Hopefully they beat Oregon State so that we can give even more updates. But we'll know more and hopefully discuss further Minnesota baseball for those who would like to hear on next week's show. Outside of that, basically, NBA draft stuff going on. The NBA draft combine was a couple weeks ago, and so players had, I believe it was 10 days. It was either a week or 10 days. For the guys who made their names available for the NBA draft, that made them available for the NBA combine. Some guys got invited to it, some didn't. And even if you did not get invited to the combine, you can still leave school early and be eligible to be drafted. There are certain guys like that. Like I think Illinois, who was it, LaRon Black? I think I remember seeing the name. Yeah, LaRon Black did not get a invite to the combine, NBA draft combine, but he's still leaving Illinois to pursue a professional career, whether it's the NBA or whether it's overseas. But so that deadline passed, I think it was May 31st, because I believe the combine ended on the 21st. But so as of May 31st, all the players that we know who are officially leaving college basketball in the Big Ten, we know that now, and we know the guys that are returning back to school. I'll list off, I guess, some of the key guys as far as who's going. For Maryland, it was interesting. Kevin Herter is a guy, a shooter who played extremely well in the NBA draft combine. I don't know if he was, planning on seriously considering the NBA or not, but when you are that kind of a sharpshooting guard and you shoot the hell out of the ball in the draft combine in front of a bunch of NBA personnel, it's like, okay, they're going to love you, because the NBA nowadays is completely based on shooting. And if you are a 6'6" wing who can shoot, that's awesome. And so I'm sure there was a team out there who said, yeah, if you make it down here to pick 28, let's say, and you're still available, we'll take you. So, or that you can even trade up and get him if you want. But that's a guy that I think most people expected Jaren Jackson Jr. from Michigan State to officially leave Michigan State and go to the draft. Same thing with Miles Bridges. Both those guys will probably be lottery picks. Jaren Jackson Jr. I've seen potentially being picked in the top 5 of the NBA draft. So those guys aren't a surprise. Maryland's Kevin Huerter, to me, was a little bit of a surprise. Ohio State's Keita Bates-Diop, who won Player of the Year in the Big Ten this past year, is another name that probably not a huge surprise for people. He is projected to probably be a second-round pick, but he was a junior. You can always grow your game, but if you take a huge leap from year 2 to 3 and become the Conference Player of the Year, I'm not sure a ton of what you can do to only be a year older in the NBA scouts' eyes and seriously improve your game that much from your junior year to senior year and say, okay, now, you've impacted your draft stock that much by returning to Ohio State. So it's understandable that he had that huge leap this past season, and now he's going into the NBA for sure. Another one, Troy, unfortunately for us, last year we liked Penn State basketball, and Tony Carr, the conference's leading scorer, also is officially leaving Penn State. Those are the 5 names, at least pointing out to me. Again, I mentioned Illinois' LaRon Black. He's not anticipated to be drafted, but there was also Corey Sanders from Rutgers. He's also officially leaving Rutgers. They both had eligibility at their respective schools, but chose not to return for different reasons. And you talked about it previously, Troy, that, if Illinois basketball isn't cutting it for you, or if Rutgers basketball isn't cutting it for you, and you think you can make it overseas and make, a couple $1 million a year, and you think that's better than returning to Illinois or Rutgers, it's hard to scream at a kid, yell at a kid, completely deny him the fact that maybe there's only so much growing you can do at Rutgers, at Illinois, and if you transfer, then you lose a year, and according to the NBA, that's a bad thing if you come out in the NBA as a 22-year-old as opposed to an 18-year-old, because that means they only have so much, less time with you as a prospect to build you up. So the older you are going in the NBA draft, the worse, basically. And to transfer and lose a year before you can even play again at a different school, that only hurts you in the NBA's eyes. So I, can somewhat get it from those players' standpoints, but basically the big names to know that are leaving the conference again: Maryland's Kevin Huerter, Michigan State, Jaren Jackson Jr., Miles Bridges, Ohio State, Player of the Year of the conference last year, Keita Bates-Diop, and Penn State's Tony Carr. Again, unfortunately for us, Troy.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it right on the head. I don't have anything to add here. You look at, if you're playing at Rutgers basketball, you've done some things. I'm not going to fault these kids for leaving. I mean, you have a chance. I mean, the thing that would be on my other side of the spectrum is you're not guaranteed to get drafted. You mentioned it, though. If they don't make it in the NBA draft, I guess there's the Dreamer League. Or if you're good enough, go overseas and, collect some bucks over there. I know people that have went over there and made a pretty decent living. They get paid to play basketball. That's nothing wrong with that. So if you think you're good enough, like I said, especially at Rutgers, Kevin, I mean, what are you going to accomplish personally at Rutgers? Are you even going to get better?
Simmons at LSU, Troy.
Oh, go ahead.
Ben Simmons at LSU couldn't even get LSU to the NCAA tournament. Like, Ben Simmons was leading LSU, and they had other talented guys on that team. I have no idea how they didn't make the NCAA tournament, but they didn't. So it's like, what, Ben Simmons is going to return to school and do what? Hopefully make the NCAA tournament when he's a completely different story because he, got picked first overall. But what's the point of returning to school if, you can only do your team so much better? And again, the older you get, the worse it is, according to the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from a standpoint of you have to weigh all the pros and the cons. And some kids enjoy college, and that's great. And there's other kids where there's nothing left to prove. The only thing is I do like the education part of it. You can't play basketball for the rest of your life. But if you're smart with your money, if you're one of these kids that may not make it in the NBA but goes overseas, collects a few bucks, if you save your money well, you'll do fine. But it's interesting. There's a big name staying in school that you sent me a text about. I guess we can spend a couple minutes on that and then move into our so-called basketball, tournament thought. So why don't you share that with the listeners? Big name returning to school.
Yeah, there's a lot of them, which is interesting. I also want to mention, too, I guess I'll hold off on that. Forget what I just said. I'll start with Wisconsin's Ethan Happ. For you, Troy, how excited are you for Mr. Happ to get back at Wisconsin? And like I'm reading some article right now as we're doing the show, and they're like, well, Wisconsin's not only getting Happ back, they're also getting the young guys that were injured throughout the season, whether it was, the remainder of season for, say 25 games for some guys, for other guys, it was just lingering issues throughout the year. Wisconsin's getting basically their full team back after having a completely, un-Wisconsin-like season where they don't finish top 5 in the conference. They don't go to the NCAA tournament. They were pretty bad this past year, which is something you can't say about Wisconsin basketball over the last 20 or so years, which is just weird. But they're returning Ethan Happ. They're returning all their young guys. So I guess that's the anticipation next year, is that Wisconsin gets back to Wisconsin-level basketball, not necessarily what they were doing, beating undefeated, Kentucky teams and making Final Fours. I don't think people expect that next year for Wisconsin, but they should be a lot better than what they were this past year, assuming that guys stay healthy. And you're returning.
Can't get much worse. You can't get much worse. For Ethan Happ, I'll say it this way. I'll talk about Ethan Happ. For Ethan Happ, that's the best move. I mean, just look at the draft. He's a good player, but he's got a lot to work on. He would be a project in the NBA, and he still will be a project when he declares next year. But if he goes this year, he may not. Maybe a team would take a fly on him in the second round. I don't see him going in the first round. Do you?
No,
he's got a lot. He's got a lot to work on. So for him, this is one of those situations where I don't think he went back necessarily because, look at all the young guys coming back and, we can be good at Wisconsin in basketball. I think he went back because he's got to work on his game. As a Badger fan, that's great. A high-level quality guy, you got to have one of those on your team to compete. But he's got a lot to work on. So as a Badger fan, it's going to be an exciting year for me to see what they do. Like I said, and I wasn't being sarcastic, it can't get much worse than last year. After all the years of success, look what happened, just crumbled. Injuries, young guys, but I also told you in our Big Ten preview, I didn't even expect Wisconsin to be in the tournament, if you remember that, Kevin, because it was a total rebuild. All the big names were gone. So that's where I was with Wisconsin last year. I didn't think they were going to do anything.
Yeah, and you were right on the head. I was wrong. I thought they would make the NCAA tournament. I didn't think they were going to finish top 5 in the conference. I figured they'd be 6th, 7th, 8th, and that would still be good enough. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And for Nebraska knows all about that, finishing 4th and still not making the NCAA tournament, and they got a pretty bad seed in the NIT tournament at that. But yeah, Wisconsin basketball is much worse than they have been in the last 20 years, a year ago. Happ's returning, and I guess what we were talking about with the guys that are officially leaving school, Happ, at age 22, if you come out a year later and you're 23 years old, you're still seen as one of those older guys. Nothing's going to change, I think, in NBA scouts' minds. I think, and you can make the debate that, what's the difference between 19 and 20 years old, 20 and 21 years old, whatever. To me, it's the guys, especially that stay in school for a couple of years. Drafting an 18-year-old kid as opposed to a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old, that's when the differences are like, okay, we need to really anticipate what we're going to get out of this kid the next couple of years, and is he going to surpass what the 20 or 21-year-old is doing now for Hap? If we draft him at 22 years old as opposed to 23, what's the difference? We're expecting a more polished basketball player, and if he can improve his game, he'll be able to show it a lot, especially at Wisconsin, because of the completely disastrous season that they had this past year. If he steps up and he, let's say, develops a three-point shot and takes Wisconsin to the NCAA tournament and they flip the record around and win 10 more games, and Ethan Happ's the leader, it's like, okay, we're getting a veteran, established leader in college basketball who turned his team around. He made his game better. Let's take a flyer on him in the second round, and see what happens. Maybe that happens. Maybe he elevates his level to the first round in terms of draft stock. I don't know. We'll know a year from now where his draft stock is at, but I think he can benefit a lot, almost particularly because Wisconsin basketball was so bad a year ago. It's one thing to take Wisconsin back to where they were, a year ago until, I guess, with being able to do that at Wisconsin and flip the program around and call yourself the leader and be the veteran would be a lot easier for him than it is Corey Sanders at Rutgers. I think that's a much taller task. So for Happ, I think he's got a lot to gain by returning, whereas Corey Sanders, it's just a different story. Unfortunately, I'll list off some other guys. Probably the biggest name to me is Purdue's Carson Edwards. He's probably the most talented guard in the conference. That's my opinion. Bridges is not a guard. Jaren Jackson is not a guard. Herter, you can call him a two-guard, whatever. Carson Edwards, I guess, most talented point guard, and Tony Carr is up there at Penn State as well, who's leaving. But I like Carson Edwards more than I like Tony Carr. And I like Tony Carr a lot, but Carson Edwards is a huge talent, and he's returning to school at Purdue. That's a huge deal for Boilermakers fans. Once that news broke, I'm sure they were all very happy with that. Michigan State's Nick Ward also returning. He's the big alongside Jaren Jackson Jr. Cassius Winston also coming back. Not that he was flirting with the draft, but Michigan State will have a few guys returning as well. Not just Jackson leaving and Bridges leaving, but they've got talented guys returning as well. In Ward, Winston, and Josh Langford, the two-guard, all three of those guys will be back alongside, whatever recruits they have coming in as well, and guys off the bench, obviously. Nebraska is returning a couple guys in James Palmer, Isaac Copeland. Those guys, and I saw a way too early.
Their schedule is going to get tougher next year, youngster. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah,
it'll be very interesting to see what that team does. I mean, it's great. It's a great story. It's a great story for Nebraska basketball, but let's wait till the schedule rolls out. I don't think it's going to be as easy as it was this year for Nebraska. And then you guys will have to just keep listening to our show for next year's Big Ten preview. That'll be right around the corner before we know it, youngster.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I read some article over the weekend that had Nebraska finishing second in conference based on the guys they returned. They basically return everybody. You would assume, again, it's easy to assume, the fourth-place team returns a lot of people. The teams ahead of them lost some guys, so Nebraska will go up. That was basically what this article was pointing to.
Why would they go up? Why would they go up? Look at the record against winning teams.
Yeah.
It wasn't good. I mean, they were fourth place. We talked about it. I'm not going to beat a stick into the ground. Nebraska was great against teams that were less 500 or less, but any team that was competitive, they pulled out a few wins, but the record was not very good. I don't know how you can pick them second. No way, no how. No, not happening. Not happening. You had to get me worked up for a little bit. There you go. That's it. That's as worked up as I get.
All right, good. I'm glad that happened. They beat Minnesota, who was ranked 14th last year in December, and then we saw what Minnesota was at the end of the season. It was not the 14th best team in the country. Let's leave it at that. The only other ranked team Nebraska beat a year ago was Michigan at one point by 20, which Michigan made the NCAA tournament and made the NCAA tournament final championship game. So that was certainly an impressive win. But I guess outside of that one win over Michigan in January, much different team 2 months later, obviously. But so Nebraska, did not do well against Ohio State, did not do well against Michigan in the Big Ten tournament, losing by 19 points, did not do well against who else? At Purdue, they lost to Kansas, they lost to Michigan State. They basically lost to every other ranked team they played. So, like you said, Troy, their schedule will undoubtedly be harder. I don't think their schedule is even finalized yet, but it's going to be hard for Nebraska to have an easier road like they did a year ago, going, 13-5 in Big Ten play. Again, they were the 4 seed in the Big Ten tournament and lost, I think, in their first game. So, unfortunately for Nebraska, yes, it's a good sign. I guess I'll leave it at that. The James Palmer, Isaac Copeland, you're getting your best guys back. That's a plus. Once the schedule comes out, it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. Just like Wisconsin football. Wisconsin football will undoubtedly have a harder schedule this upcoming fall than they did a year ago. That's why the rumors were out there that it's like, hey, Wisconsin could finish the regular season undefeated last year. And we're like, we're not so sure, and they did. Partly because of the schedule, partly because guys stepped up, partly because no one knew Jonathan Taylor would run for almost 2,000 yards as a freshman. But Wisconsin did their thing with a light schedule. Nebraska did theirs. Unfortunately, they didn't have an automatic qualifier for the NCAA tournament, so they didn't make it. But some other names I just want to read off. Maryland is returning Bruno Fernando, a big. Purdue's returning Nogel Eastern, as well as Carson Edwards. Some other guys, I'm just looking here. Michigan's Charles Matthews is coming back. That'll help the Wolverines. They're picked by some guys, and that's also, I guess, my last basketball thing. I'll get to that in a second. Iowa, Isaiah Moss is returning. Tyler Cook's returning for Iowa, and Indiana, Juwan Morgan is also returning. But the last thing I wanted to get to, Troy, with college basketball, at least this topic, is Michigan and Michigan State, as of right now, betting odds to win the Big Ten, to win the NCAA tournament for next year, for 2019. Michigan and Michigan State both have the same odds. I think it was 25-1. They both have the same odds next year. And, not that we're going to preview both teams right now for, 30 minutes in depth on each, but Michigan, Michigan State, I guess your quick thoughts on both those teams right now being projected as the best Big Ten teams for next season.
It's too early. you know how I feel about that. That would be like, okay, I'll say, Michigan's going to win, and then they don't win, and then people will say, well, the old man said they were going to win back in June. Well, I don't even pay attention. I know people that are betting people that probably already put bets down. I mean, at 25-1 odds, put down $100. I mean, if you got $100, I mean that would be a great return if it happened. Now they're going to be two good teams, but the NCAA tournament is a different beast, and we haven't even got to practice, haven't even got to the cupcake games, haven't got to the conference games. I mean, you look at the run that Michigan had last year, Kevin, and who would have thought they would have been in the championship game? You and I didn't. I mean, I didn't pick them. I picked them in the Final Four, but they were playing good basketball, and all year they were the team that just kind of plodded along in the Big Ten. That's what Michigan's MO is. Just going to be like, we're gonna play good basketball. Nobody can talk about it. Boom, then we're going to be in a championship game. See ya.
Michigan. 2 months before the March Madness tournament started, they lost to Nebraska by 20 points. No one thought Michigan was going to go on some ridiculous run and make the title game.
Nope.
And that was 2 months before the tournament started. Let alone, we're talking about this in June.
Yeah. So my thoughts on it: good for Vegas, good for the bettors out there. Go ahead, take your bets, make your bets, drop $100 down, do what you want to do. I could care less. That's all I got.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm not going to get in depth on it either. I don't think there's any Big Ten team that should be almost favored to win the thing like Michigan State was a year ago, and we saw how that turned out. They lost in the second round. So you can be a juggernaut all year long, like Kentucky was when they were undefeated, and you can go 3-9 in your last 12 games, like South Carolina did a couple of years ago. I kept bringing that up last season about how they were terrible entering the NCAA tournament 2 years ago, and then they beat Duke and made the Final Four, went on that kind of run. Certain teams just get hot. in March. And Butler can make, the title game 2 years in a row. Syracuse always seems to make a run every other year. They ended Michigan State's season last year. There are just some teams that basically come out of nowhere, whether it's in March or right before March, and it's like, hey, this team that we thought was the 30th best team in the country could win the whole thing. That's March Madness. It's a one-game series, so to say, as you keep plotting your way through the tournament. So, again, to talk about in-depth stuff with Michigan State, the Big Ten teams where, these teams might finish in June is just kind of ridiculous. So I won't get into it. But our last topic, Troy, you brought up last week on last week's show that talking about baseball and softball, these past couple weeks in particular, and how their NCAA tournaments are formatted. And you basically have 16 different little pods of 4. You think about March Madness, and you've got 4 regions. You got the West region, you got Midwest, North, East, whatever it is. I don't even remember what the 4 regions are each year. But regardless, you have 4 regions of 16 teams in each. You got your 4 1 seeds, you got your 4 16 seeds, and so on in between. But for baseball, softball, it's different. You have 16 different little pods of 4. And we saw in baseball that Minnesota, okay, you had a really good year. You won the Big Ten tournament. Here's the number 1 seed. You get to host in the postseason for not just one game, not just 2 games, but many games, basically until you get eliminated in your own regional. So it's interesting. I like the idea. I like the concept of playing in the regular season and having it matter enough to be able to host in the postseason. I think that would create more urgency for college basketball going forward, as opposed to, hey, look, Duke plays Kansas this week. And it's like, okay, we're in the month of December. It's not going to mean basically anything 3-4 months from now once the selection committee is like, hey, do we take Duke or do we take Arizona as a 1 seed? Well, let's look back at November and see what Duke did against Kansas. I mean, it just doesn't matter because it's 4 months, 5 months prior to the March Madness selection committee selecting their teams and what seeds they get. So I like the idea of having the regular season probably matter more in this scenario that you brought up, where if the basketball tournament changes its format to baseball or softball, which it's probably not going to. It's just a thought that Troy had a couple weeks ago, but I like the idea because, again, it makes every game matter more because you can dissect it and there are more teams. There would be 16 teams hosting, and you get series out of it. Like baseball, softball, it's a double elimination tournament in regionals. So you would have, I guess, potentially less Cinderella teams as well. I don't think UMBC beats Virginia 2 times out of 3. But that's, I think you get more of the better teams advancing that way. I think it would be interesting to see what Virginia would do against a top dog, as opposed to seeing UMBC beat Virginia and then lose by 20 points in the next round. So I like your idea. I don't think it will change anytime soon to this, but I like the idea of having double elimination stuff, having a best of 3, having a best of 7 like the NBA. The NCAA is not going to do that, but I like having a better chance at seeing the better teams advance, and we talked about this in not necessarily this show, but other shows that Troy and I do with the NFL, that it's like not even the best team wins the Super Bowl every single year, because it's just you get hot one game, the ball tips your way one game in the postseason, and you can upset the Patriots. You can beat Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. You can beat the best team. You can beat the Patriots when they were undefeated. If you're the Giants,
Jacksonville can beat the Pittsburgh Steelers.
There you go. It just takes one game. It just takes one game for an upset to happen, and especially in football, you need to win. Some teams only need to win 3 games, and you win the Super Bowl. So I like the idea of having more games, having a series, and letting the better team and letting more strategy, I think, get implemented. We see it in the NBA where series changes, like Boston and Milwaukee, for example. And I keep rambling on here. I'll let you talk, Troy, but in basketball, you see it a lot more in a 7-game series where it's like, okay, this strategy isn't working the first couple games, the first 4 games, the first 5 games. Let's switch and see what happens. And then all of a sudden the series turns, momentum goes in your way, and you just have to win a couple more games and you can beat that team. To get lucky from the 3-point line 7 more times than the other team in one game, sure, UMBC can beat Virginia, or Golden State can lose one game to an 8 seed. But in the end, Golden State's the better team. I want to see them advance and play a full series, and we're seeing that now in the NBA. So to me, I guess not necessarily that I don't want to see Cinderellas and I don't want to see those cool stories happening, but I like the idea of what baseball and softball are doing. I like your idea there of changing it. I'm curious on your thoughts, I guess, a week later.
Well, I didn't throw the idea of like, hey, this is what I want to see. I just threw the idea of like, would it be cool or would it not be cool? And there's actually two sides to this story, Kevin. I'm an old guy. I'm a traditionalist. I like tradition. I don't like huge change. This would be a huge change. I do like the Cinderellas. I like rooting for the underdog in March Madness. However, there's a sports side of me, an actual sports fan side of me, that would love to see the best teams keep advancing to see the best basketball. Right. Now, I'm not saying that these Cinderellas don't give us a good storyline or don't even give us good basketball. They do. They play good basketball. But at some point, the Cinderella story ends. It just ends. And then I look along the way, and it's like, okay, well, Virginia gets knocked out in the first round. They were a good basketball team, Kevin. Granted, you knew the style of play that they had, and they had to play with a lead, so on and so forth. But they were one of the better teams in the country. And they were sitting at home after the first game. And now some people say, well, that's the way it is. Well, that is the way it is. You should have took care of business. But in this format, if you go into a double elimination first round and then let those 16 teams move into the Sweet 16, I think you're going to get about 14 of the top teams in the country at that point. You're going to get a Cinderella. There's going to be a team that can play hot. But like you said, it's a double elimination. So you could lose to Virginia, then go into the next losers, into the losers bracket, win. Virginia can win again, and then boom, there you go. You're playing Virginia again. So can you do it? Can you go in and can you beat them? I like the idea. It'll never happen. I just was thinking, man, that certainly would be a way for the NCAA to make sure that their basketball tournament has the best, well, I shouldn't say has the best, but most of the best teams will advance out of those rounds, those little pods, because talent will overtake most other teams in a series.
Yeah.
Like you said, Virginia loses that first game. Tony Bennett's making huge, major changes, adjustments, learning from it. They're not losing to that team again. Not going to happen. So, I mean, I threw it out there because it was, like, intriguing to me. And there's one part of me that as just the fan, just like the fan of NCAA March Madness, don't change it. I like the Cinderellas. I like rooting for the underdog. I can still root for the underdog in this format, but it's going to be almost merely impossible for one of those really low teams to get out of that pot. And the other thing, as I was thinking after I said it last week, you got all these automatic bids. How do you make these pods fair? I mean, you're going to have some pods that are probably going to be a little bit heavy, and you're probably going to lose some of the best teams in the country. And then you're going to have other pods where you have some of these mid-major, mid-level teams, and so they're going to advance, and then it's almost like you're giving them a present, if that makes any sense to you, Kevin. So yeah. I thought about it a lot from the week, and, it would be intriguing. I mean, I wouldn't even cause a fuss if they did that. But when I looked at some of the intrinsics, the logistics, I mean, I don't know if it would even be possible to pull it off because you have so many automatic bids. And, I mean, what are the at-large bids down to, Kevin? 8? I can't remember. I think it's only like 8 at-large bids or left.
For college basketball, I think it's less than half the field. It's not as low as 8. There's like 30, I want to say. I think there are more conferences. It's hard to get an at-large because you think about it, okay, there's 30 at-large teams. That's a lot. Well, not really, because like just the ACC. Okay, Duke wins or we'll take last year. For example, Virginia wins the ACC tournament. Okay, North Carolina has to get an at-large. Duke has to get an at-large. Miami has to get an at-large. Just from the ACC alone, you got like 7 in there that didn't win the tournament that have to get in because they're, had great regular seasons. Miami had a really good regular season. They have to get in the tournament. That's Miami. That's not, counting Duke and North Carolina. So, yeah, there are maybe 30 at-larges, but every year the ACC is going to get like 7 or 8 of those. The Big Ten is going to get 4 or 5 of those, and the Pac-12 is going to get, you would assume, 4 or 5 of those, and the same with the Big 12, same with, so there's really not a lot, and Nebraska saw that. I mean, Nebraska finished 4th in the Big Ten. They had 13 conference wins. We talked about, hey, if you get 11, you should be good to go. Nebraska had 13, and they didn't get in. So it may sound like a lot with there being 30 at-larges, whatever the number is. It's something around there, but it's hard to get in. And then there are some of those top-tier mid-major programs that don't win their conference tournaments, and they'll get in. As 10 seeds, 11 seeds. It's like, okay, we know you're one of the best 68 teams in the country. So we'll invite Gonzaga if they don't win the West Coast Conference. Teams like that where it's just like, okay, you won 30 games. You're not a school we've never heard of. We've heard of, whoever it is, Wichita State, some team like that. I don't think Wichita State won their conference tournament, and they're in the field of 64 or 68. But so in general, I guess with your idea, I like it, and I like the way the tournament is now. I guess that's kind of my final point. I've got another thing I can mention as well, but that's my overarching final thought is that I like the way the NCAA tournament is now for college basketball. I think it's fun. I think it's awesome. I think it's crazy, and you can know so much information, and you predict your little bracket, and it's like all UMBC has to do is hit a few more threes than Virginia, and boom, your team that you may have picked to win the whole thing is out in the first round. I picked Arizona to go to the title game. They were out in the first round. I picked Michigan State to win the title. They were out in the second round. I mean, I was done. Boom, like that, over, done. So that's what makes it interesting, is that you have these Cinderella stories. But I also wanted to ask you this, Troy, is that we all like these Cinderellas. We all like UMBC winning. We all like Loyola Chicago making the Final Four. But in the end, and it's interesting to me because we always talk about how we like these Cinderella stories and all these upsets and these teams getting through. But in the end, honestly, and you know how much I like college basketball, Troy, Loyola Chicago played Kansas State in the Elite Eight. Nobody cares about Kansas State basketball. Nobody cares about Loyola Chicago basketball, honestly.
No, only because they were Cinderellas, and that's what I was alluding to in the beginning.
Yeah.
That as a sports fan, I would love to see the best teams keep advancing in the top games.
I was going to ask you, Troy, did you watch Kansas State Loyola Chicago? Because honestly, me, as a college basketball,
I watched parts of it because I have it on.
Yeah.
And I watched parts of it, but I didn't sit down and put my DVR to Kansas State
right.
Loyola, no. But
right.
I flipped it on because it was easy to with the way they have coverage.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll say this. I didn't watch a single second of it. I don't remember. It was possible for me to watch it. I'll say that it wasn't like I was, away at work and couldn't watch it. I could watch it. I didn't watch a single second of it. And I'm a huge college basketball fan. It's an Elite Eight game. 2 really cool stories in both teams, especially Loyola Chicago because they are a mid-major team. I didn't watch a single second of it. So I like the upsets. I think they're cool. I think they're fun. If you throw, I'm not going to say Duke because I'm a Duke fan. If you throw, let's say, Kansas instead of Kansas State in there, I would have tuned into Kansas Loyola Chicago. But Kansas State Loyola Chicago, it just didn't get my interest. I knew one team that wasn't a legitimate Final Four team that was going to cut down the nets, honestly, was going to advance. Honestly, that's what I thought of it. So I like the Cinderellas. I think they're cool, but in the end, like you, Troy, I think I want to see the better teams advance. And if, honestly, Loyola Chicago proves to be a top 4 team, let them prove it. 4 times or twice. Have to beat Miami twice, have to beat Tennessee twice, have to beat Nevada twice. Nevada has to beat Cincinnati twice. Have Kansas State have to beat Virginia twice if Virginia actually does move on past UMBC. Prove that you are worthy of being a top 8 team if you are Kansas State. So I like the idea. I like the tournament of how it is now, but I also like your idea. And it's the same thing with college football. I like the idea of expanding it to 8 teams and having each major conference represented. I get that because you can't with 4 teams. You can't have every conference, the major conference, the 5 major conferences. One conference gets snubbed every single year. This past year, 2 did because the SEC had 2 teams make it, which ended up making the title game. So I'm not going to fault that decision by the playoff committee, but to expand it to 8 and to have the top mid-major program like UCF a year ago that went perfect and beat Auburn in the bowl game. They finished the year 13-0, and they didn't get a chance to play against Alabama. They didn't get a chance to play against whoever was in the college football playoff because they just didn't have a good enough resume. If you make that an automatic qualifier of being, the top ranked, let's say, at the end of the season mid-major team, and you throw them in that little last pot of 8 teams to make the playoff, expand it to 8, I would enjoy that. I would like to see UCF play Alabama. They beat Auburn, and people thought Auburn was better than Alabama a year ago. I would like to see that. But I also like the drama of what 4 teams brings in college football. So to me, I guess my overarching thing is I want to see these Cinderella stories as much as the next guy, but in the end, I don't want to see them necessarily too much. And I want to see the better teams advance. And honestly, I like the way it is now, but I also like the baseball softball idea that you have for basketball, and I like college football's idea of it now with having only 4 teams. And there's a ton of drama at the end of the year because of that. Who should get in? That's a huge thing in college football every single year. I love that. But I also like the fact of having 8 teams and having more chances for teams that are deserving of it. You can't say the Pac-12 tournament or Pac-12 conference winner isn't deserving of having a chance at winning the national title. Maybe, you can say they don't because they lost a couple games, whatever. I think it would be cool to at least see. I think it'd be cool to see UCF in there against Alabama. I think it'd be cool to see. So I'm not against any of this, and maybe I can sound stupid saying, yeah, I like this idea, I like that idea, I like this idea. I don't like every idea that's out there, but right now, this topic that we're debating, I like it. I like seeing the better teams advance. In general, this specific topic, college basketball, having 16 different little pods of 4, and teams host at least that first round and the regional round it's called. I like it as a whole. I've got, I guess, nothing else to say about it.
I got nothing else either. It's time to let these wonderful people go. I think we wrapped it up good. Maybe we'll touch on that at a later time. But hope you enjoyed the show today. For the youngster, I am the old man. Find us on Twitter at Kid Cunny is the youngster. I am Troy Robert 967. Follow our show handle at Youngster Old Man. We will get back at you next week. Have a good week, everyone.